Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, Volunteerism During COVID-19, presented by Independent Sector and VolunteerMatch. My name is Marie LeBlanc, Director of Design at Independent Sector. COVID-19 is an unprecedented crisis for our country, the charitable sector, and the people, paid and unpaid, who devote time every day to improving their communities. Volunteerism is an essential part of our country's social fabric and is perhaps most vital during times of crisis. The COVID-19 pandemic has fundamentally changed the very nature of how people can connect with and help each other. For the next hour, I'll be joined by Laura Plato, Chief Solutions Officer at VolunteerMatch, and some special guests to discuss critical needs and long-term opportunities to sustain volunteerism in your community in this uncertain time. I'll offer a few housekeeping notes before I turn it over to Laura. All lines are currently muted. Questions will be taken at the end of the presentation, so please submit your questions using the Q&A box on your screen. This webinar is being recorded and will be emailed to you within 24 hours. Please also make sure that you take the survey at the end of the webinar. Your feedback is really essential in helping us plan for future events. For those new to Independent Sector, we extend a special welcome. Independent Sector is a national membership organization representing a diverse set of nonprofits, foundations, and corporate giving programs working to ensure all people in the United States thrive. We're pleased to offer additional resources and support to the charitable sector during this time. You can visit independentsector.org/COVID-19 to learn, engage, and take action on issues related to nonprofit response and relief for the COVID-19 pandemic. You can also visit independentsector.org/membership to consider joining us as a member if you're not already. Now, I'm pleased to introduce Laura Plato to offer a welcome from VolunteerMatch.
Thanks, Marie, and thank you to everybody. I see literally hundreds of folks joining us as we're getting started. It's wonderful to have all of you here today. This is such an important topic, volunteerism in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. And, you know, I wanted to offer a little bit of context as we get started today. My team at VolunteerMatch, we set out in mid-March to start to understand what the experience was like for our nonprofit partners, our corporate partners, and our individual volunteers during this amazing time in our history. And I have to say, I never could have predicted the magnitude or the speed of change that we've seen. It's been less than 45 days since we started talking to our constituents and reorienting our own programs and services towards responding and reacting to a COVID-19 world. And I'm really excited and happy and fortunate that today we're going to be hearing from Doug Bolton of Cincinnati Cares and Michele Weisner from Hire Heroes USA about their experiences during these unprecedented times. I'm confident we're all going to learn a lot. I want to thank you both for agreeing to share what you're experiencing and what you've been doing with us today. And again, just a little bit more context for folks as we kick off. You know, when we opened our early listening posts at VolunteerMatch, that was in mid-March, about 93% of our nonprofits were saying they were already experiencing major cancellation of their volunteering events. And hundreds of our corporate partners were saying they were trying to pivot to virtual and online programming and trying to figure out how to continue to engage employees in volunteering. At the same time, they were canceling their efforts and considering them non-essential meetings at many of our partners, at least having to hit pause. So this really is an extraordinary time for us to be working in. And on March 26th, we launched our formal response. And to give you a sense of the scope and magnitude of change I was talking about, when we launched our response and presented an opportunities hub that featured more virtual volunteering and more local opportunities related specifically to COVID-19, I presented on a webinar and I shared that we had about 70,000 virtual roles open and needed, and about 35,000 local roles needed. Today, I just took a look at the data. It's about 1 month later. We have over 250,000 open virtual roles and over 117,000 local ones, again, just related to COVID-19. So these are truly extraordinary times. And I want to thank each of you for taking time with us today. If you are a volunteer or if you're working with volunteers, I think you're going to find this a really good program. And Michele, I'm going to turn it over to you to get us started in this discussion and help ground us a little bit in what your organization has been experiencing and doing in terms of COVID-19 volunteerism. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Laura. Hi, everyone. My name is Michele Wiesner. I'm the Director of Capacity Building at Hire Heroes USA. We are a national nonprofit organization dedicated to empowering U.S. military members, veterans, and spouses to succeed in the civilian workforce. We've been in existence since about 2005, and we've got a few statistics there in terms of our scope and breadth. We helped just over 18,000 individuals last year in some aspect of the job search, and we helped over 10,400 actually secure employment in a meaningful way. So we're assisting clients in all 50 states, some who are still stationed overseas, getting ready to transition out of the military and into the civilian workforce for the very first time. We've got about 6 offices nationwide, so most of our services are done virtually. We service people all over the world and are able to assist them with resume writing, interview preparation, really any aspect of the job search. Our volunteer program is also set up in a similar way for virtual service delivery. It was started a little bit later in our organization's history. Back in 2012, we were tasked with creating a volunteer program that matched meaningful opportunities and the generosity of volunteers to the needs of our organization. So that's really where my history with the organization began. I was brought on board as the organization's first volunteer coordinator, privileged with creating this program from scratch, and was really fortunate to be able to start a virtual volunteer program. So we've been in a really unique, fortunate situation to be able to pivot kind of easily from COVID-19, still able to serve clients all across the world, still able to use volunteers all across the country in meaningful ways. So hoping that today can share some of our best practices that we've seen across the timeline of our organization that will hopefully help some of you out there. Just to give you some context of our volunteer program, last year we had a little over 740 unique volunteers actually give about 4,800 hours to the organization, and the vast majority of those hours were given virtually. So again, hoping that we can share some best practices with you today to hopefully help you in your endeavors to continue serving your clients and engaging your stakeholders. So with that, I'll toss it over to Doug.
Thanks, Michele, and thanks, Marie and Laura. So, you know, Marie, Independent Sector, we engaged with your organization at the end of last year at the Upswell conference. Seems like ages ago, and we were there because we had been named by Independent Sector as an Innovate for Good finalist with our platform, our board connecting platform. So it was a great opportunity to talk with Independent Sector and all of its members about you know, the challenge that every community faces around the country with creating wider boards, welcoming, inclusive, diverse, equitable, and representative boards, and the artificial infused technology that we've created that is solving that problem in Cincinnati, and how that could be applied to communities all across America. And you know, Laura, we've been obviously big fans and admirers of VolunteerMatch for decades. I'm a Cincinnati businessman who's on his 3rd act, spent 25 years in the media business, then ran a big commercial real estate services firm, and then had the great fortune of joining Craig Young and our parent organization, Inspiring Service, which was created to fix the volunteer ecosystem in Cincinnati. You know, as everybody on this call knows, national volunteerism was declining, 15-year low. And at that point in time, in Cincinnati, we were actually declining twice the national rate. And so now here 3 years later, after the creation of our organization, we've gone from, in Cincinnati, worst among our peers to best among our peers, largely because of innovative technologies that like the board platform, like Skills, but predominantly a community-wide volunteer guide that helps connect the volunteers to the nonprofits in our community. More than 700 of the nonprofits in Cincinnati. Other communities have seen what we were doing, and so essentially building new volunteer ecosystems in Boston and Los Angeles and every place in between. And so throughout all of our systems, in December, January, February, record numbers, and then along comes mid-February, and everybody starts to get a little nervous about COVID. And I'm still coming because I want to help, but I'm not quite sure about this COVID situation, so I'm not going to follow through at this time until I can really figure out what's going on. And so we knew at that time that we needed to pivot and do something differently. And so we know, everywhere in this country, everywhere needs help. Our sector, the nonprofit sector, is reeling. I mean, thanks to independent sector, we've gotten the federal aid that we deserve and need, but still the sector is reeling in every way. I heard this morning on a phone call that the Pittsburgh Children's Museum is thinking about closing for at least a year because of COVID. So things like that happening in every community across the country. The next slide, Marie. Everywhere needs help. And we know that people everywhere want to help. And so what we've been focusing on is of course connecting them. The next slide. So, who we are, Cincinnati Cares has created the best and most comprehensive nonprofit directory, connecting, making it easy to discover volunteering and giving opportunities wherever they exist. That platform has expanded to Boston and LA and the state of Nevada and 15 other communities across the country. And now the next slide talks about, I heard on a seminar this morning that what we all have to get used to is being in gray. And so if you're British, you appreciate my spelling here of gray. If you're American, maybe not so much, but we are in a gray sky period. And so what we know our nonprofits need in every one of our community is better data and stories about telling the impact of how COVID has impacted them in their community, but also in the state and across the country. And so our platform has pivoted now to focus predominantly on helping our nonprofit partners share that data, tell their stories. Like Laura said, there's an immense amount of growth in the COVID ways to help now. And so guiding people to those places where those opportunities exist, as well as originally on all of our sites. And then finally giving, if the volunteer isn't quite ready to take action, they can find their way to donate, because most of our nonprofits, as Laura indicated, they're canceling events. They're not able to deliver on their mission revenue. They're not able to fundraise in their normal way. And so the sector needs as much support and collection around that effort as possible. So the next slide, essentially talks about, this is a, it's trite to say that this is unprecedented, because what we're losing in this sector is essentially $3 billion every single week. 3 out of 4 nonprofits engage volunteers. And so that is costing us. Obviously, we think it's going to be a slow recovery. And then on top of the volunteer loss of the $3 billion, there's immense other pain going on in our sector. And so the support has to be built around our nonprofits in a manner that's effective for them, and telling stories, telling data, providing people with guidance to get to the places where they can help, either by volunteering or donating, is going to be very important. So the next slide, essentially says that we are volunteer ecosystem rebuilders today. We rebuilt Cincinnati. We're rebuilding a number of other communities and helping to do that, but do it efficiently, like VolunteerMatch is doing with new technology tools. We know that every community, the next slide, has a need right now more than ever to be able to build volunteerism in a way that is different maybe than what we have experienced before. Because this disaster that we're experiencing now, who knows whether or not there's going to be another pandemic. And like in typical disaster recovery, you don't build, insanity is in hurricane recovery, you build the same house that just got obliterated, you build it in the same place and in the same way. We in this sector should not rebuild volunteerism and connections to volunteerism in the same way that we have for the last 20 years. We need to do it differently. So thanks again, Marie and Laura, for allowing us to talk about what we're doing and helping to build a more resilient nonprofit ecosystem.
That's some great context, Doug, and absolutely, that every time I see these pieces of data, it's just stunning to me, isn't it? I mean, $3 billion a week, most of us can't even fathom what $3 billion looks like, period.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Amazing.
Yeah.
I'm curious, you've given us already some great insights, Doug, and I'd love to invite folks. I see some more Q&A continuing to come in, so please do continue to use that Q&A functionality to submit some questions to us. I'll kick us off a little bit and just ask you, Doug, you've shared a little bit about what the experience has been like at Cincinnati Cares. You're obviously servicing several communities at this point and continuing to expand. I love this ecosystem rebuilder concept. What a great descriptor of who you guys are and what you do. Talk to us a little bit about what that experience has been like for you over the last month and a half. How have you had to think differently or act differently to get to that place of what it looks like to be an ecosystem rebuilder?
Sure. So, as I said, we saw the data across many of our systems, where volunteers wanted to take action, but they just didn't feel comfortable. And so, the first thing was being able to essentially provide in every one of our communities a channel for those volunteers who wanted to help, giving them the place that they can go to be able to express that and begin to find those places. Then of course the data and the story. We've been involved in the Encore network, and in particular its Gen-to-Gen program. We were one of 7 cities to launch that across the country, and so a key part of that is the storytelling capability, essentially making sure that mentors everywhere, the Gen-to-Gen connection can see themselves in the volunteering. And so the story part of that was so important, and that part of our platform already existed. And so putting that front and center in this new era was something that was easy for us to be able to do. And I think what we've seen is every community is different, and that so the ecosystems are at different states everywhere we go, different states of being, and so that's how a doing it community by community can help us be more flexible and more adaptive to the needs of that particular community. Now, I get it. There's no difference in human beings. They want to help regardless. So that's the same across all of our country. Americans absolutely want to help, but most of them want to do it in their neighborhood, near where they work. And so being able to connect them to the things that are close by is so critical at this time, especially because we don't know what the new normal is going to be. Are people going to go back and do the same volunteering that they were doing before this? New habits may be created through this process of being stayed at home for the last 6 weeks. And so that rebuilding is part of what we're going to have to do as volunteer ecosystem rebuilders to get people to do things maybe that they've stopped doing for the last 6 weeks and make sure they come back to it.
Thanks, Doug. I'm going to jump in, and Michele, I want to bring you back into the conversation as well, and just so appreciate how you both have talked about the role of technology in facilitating the type of, really the core, I think, of how you're thinking about volunteerism now, and both in the programs that either you have been offering or certainly a way for us to move forward. Michele, we've had a couple of questions come in about virtual volunteering, and would love to hear more from you about that, and maybe just to talk a little bit about your experience about challenges that folks may navigate with virtual volunteering that are different than in-person volunteer opportunities, and just some things to keep in mind if you're considering virtual volunteerism for the first time.
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Marie. So there's a few things with virtual volunteerism. Of course, with any kind of volunteerism, virtual or in person, there are lots of volunteer management best practices that still apply and go across platform or method of engagement. So don't throw the best practices out the window. That's my first piece of advice. But there are some challenges that are kind of specific to the virtual platform. One is really the resources or tools. If you have a volunteer coming into your office or on site, you usually have the physical resources or the physical tools on hand for them to use. Now, if they're off site at their home, how are they going to be engaging in the specific task? So you as the volunteer manager or volunteer administrator have to think through what those tools and resources are, what equipment your volunteers may or may not have, and try and address those head on. Another piece that can be challenging is engagement. So if someone's coming into your office every single week, you can chat with them, you can have some coffee with them, get to know them over time. If those engagements are virtual, you probably don't have the same amount of time to build a relationship with them or in the same method, obviously. So doing regular communication with your volunteers, figuring out how you're going to create that connection and create rapport with them kind of from the onset of them getting to know your organization is also really important and can be challenging depending on their comfort level with technology, events like this or email communication, things like that. And then the last challenge that seems kind of obvious, but I think it's worth noting, is the actual supervision piece. So if you've got volunteers that are on site in your office, you usually have staff or maybe other volunteer leaders who are there supervising and helping the volunteer in the execution of the task. But obviously, if they're at their homes, you don't have that same advantage. It's not that you're going to turn on a webinar and say, okay, point the camera at this task that you're doing. That typically doesn't work out very well. It's not a good use of anyone's time. So you have to think of alternative methods for addressing that supervision and the feedback piece. So making sure that the expectations are known up front, making sure that there's a way for you to give feedback to the volunteer once a task is done so that they know, hey, you did this really well, or maybe there's something, an additional resource we need to provide, or maybe some additional clarification we need to provide to you. So those are just a few of the challenges that, again, aren't incredibly unique. They exist for volunteer managers regardless of their execution policies, but we've definitely seen them on the virtual side. They're a little more prevalent.
Great, thank you. That's super helpful.
Yeah, those are some great tips, Michele. And I'm curious, let's turn the spotlight a little bit. So virtual obviously feels like a really safe way to engage volunteers during this time. And we've heard from a lot of folks that that's one of the #1 concerns, is how do we safely engage volunteers during COVID-19 now or in the future? Have either of you got any tips for us on what you're seeing is working well in terms of practices?
So I think the best thing that we're seeing is thinking completely outside the box. So I think that absolutely we have to follow the CDC guidelines and do everything that will keep our volunteers safe. There's obviously, with every generation, there's different levels of concern. And so we have to be adaptive to those. But I think the key thing is thinking completely differently, 180-degree shift around how you engage volunteers. For example, we had one nonprofit in Cincinnati who, had a project that they had to get done to be able to essentially fulfill some grant expectations that were not being released as a result of COVID. And so they essentially posted the ability to, who in our community has a drone that can come and do the inspections that we need of all of these playgrounds that we have all throughout our community. That we have to have these pictures, we have to have the details in order to be able to get the revenue that we had promised to do these programs and comply. And literally they were able to find someone in our community who had a drone and was able to do that in a socially distant, safe way. So I think the key answer is just thinking completely different. This is a time when I think we've seen the foundation community, we've seen others have stepped up and released restrictions and have released the typical standards and the procedures and the protocols, and all of that behavior should be encouraged because our sector is in crisis, and we have to think creatively, whether it's a way that we've really never been comfortable engaging volunteers before, and now you're forced to do that, either because you've had to furlough staff or you don't know if you can keep your staff. So that's what has to be infused in our sector right now is creativity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I agree. The creativity is absolutely key, and I think for people who do volunteer management on the regular, they probably are in the habit of putting those creative hats on for the problem solving that they engage in. But to Doug's point, we're in a totally different scenario right now, so it's just stepping that up to the next level and really being an example for your peers in your organization as well.
Mm-hmm. So I want to jump in on that, on Doug, something you were mentioning there, when organizations are starting to face constrictions in budget and staffing, furlough situations, things like that. One of the questions that comes up may be how volunteerism actually can be a tool for resiliency in the face of some of the other constraints that we're seeing. And if we think about the role of skilled volunteers in particular to help nonprofits ensure that there's business continuity in areas that might be a challenge, or build resiliency as we think about the ongoing challenges that we may be facing this year. I'm curious if either Doug, you or Michele have thoughts on that, about examples or really good ways that you've seen volunteerism be a tool to build resiliency in organizations.
Yeah, I mean, another example, a small college in Cincinnati, unable to make the pivot as most education institutions are needing to make to a distance learning environment. They sought essentially the IT community and reached out and connected to that community in a way that essentially they always would have thought, I've got to pay for this, but because of this crisis, they were able to make it an appeal to other people in business right now that are kind of slow because nobody's buying lots of stuff for their businesses. So essentially tapping that skill-based workforce right now is critical. There's lots of people that are either furloughed or have a little amount of work if they remain employed in their current work that can engage. And then the other thing to think highly about in the volunteer sector around skills-based is our students. So we've seen in many of our communities where students are not being able to do co-ops this summer. No company wants to have that liability, and so co-op programs throughout the country are essentially going backwards And so those universities still have some funding that would allow them to place those college students into nonprofits to be able to do what those college kids either have already learned, lots of skills and lots of ingenuity. So those are just a couple of examples of where the traditional thought of skill-based volunteering sounds complicated. You have to do projects and management and all those kinds of things, where actually you can make skills-based volunteering work for you in a quick and easy way.
Those are all great ideas. And I'm just kind of monitoring the Q&A a little, and I'd love, I think we're looking forward to I'm hearing a lot of opportunity in what you're sharing, Doug and Michele, a lot of new creative ways to think about things, obviously a lot of unanticipated challenges that are going to be ahead of us. I'd love to address some of the questions that I see coming in that are about, services that are provided hands-on. So we've got some questions here from some hospice folks, who are volunteering or managing volunteers in the hospice space, folks who have therapy dogs and handlers. So these are activities that are really grounded in the idea of human connection, physical connection with one another. How do we support folks like that in thinking creatively? I love the drone example. How do we think about what's the equivalent of a drone example, or various ideas for folks like this? Do either of you have any tips? And even maybe not so much to the solutioning, but how do you think creatively as a manager to get to the solution? Any tips for folks?
Yeah, I'll jump in on that right quick. Just to give some context, so our organization, the volunteer opportunities that we have primarily are mentoring, so skills-based connections between a volunteer and then a job-seeking military veteran or spouse who want to learn more about a specific industry or specific company. So mentoring, I think, is you typically imagine like two people having coffee together or in a face-to-face engagement, and our volunteers and clients hardly ever meet face-to-face because they're in different states, they're on separate sides of the country. So you can break down what you want to get out of an opportunity, trying to think of alternative ways, whether it's a phone call. Of course, not everybody can, not every volunteer opportunity can be translated into a virtual opportunity, but there are lots that can be, or there can be tangential opportunities that kind of get to what you're trying to accomplish with the original in-person volunteer opportunities. So I know that's not a solution necessarily, but just trying to think about what do I want to accomplish, and then kind of reverse engineering how to do that without, putting people in the same space.
I do see, just kind of on that note, Laura, someone had asked also about conservation organizations, and that's obviously something you can't do inside. You can do some conservation inside your house, but really we're talking about the world outside and how you engage folks in that. And I've seen some creative examples here in Washington, D.C., where we are based, with organizations encouraging you to think more broadly about the land that we should be conserving, and that it could be where you're going on your walk, if you're hopefully getting out and able to go for a walk or spend some time outside during the day, and just to maybe be a little more creative in thinking about the spaces that you're protecting. Someone also asked, what kind of requirements would there be around PPE and providing personal protective equipment if you are providing opportunities for folks to be out in the world and potentially interacting. Those are certainly questions I would say you want to think about very carefully, and think about the liabilities that you have as an organization to protect volunteers in this time, even if you are offering different types of alternate volunteer engagement that may not have quite the concentration of connection, but particularly as we think about the world is starting to transition and open up a little bit, but you would want to have really deliberate conversations internally about the responsibility that you have to be protecting your volunteers and anyone who's doing work on behalf of you in this moment. So I did want to respond to that there. I'm not sure if anyone else has thoughts on that around what organizations might be thinking about as we're looking to the future? There are a couple of questions that have come in about this, but what's next as we, as we start to open up, as we start to have the opportunity maybe to be outside a little bit more? Are you starting to see things that organizations may want to think about in the next phase of what our uncertain world looks like?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's going to be essentially we as a sector, we as volunteer administrators, we as operators of nonprofits have to understand that everyone is going to react to this differently. And so what I mean by that is, probably 70% of the population, our clients, our employees, you name it, are going to be in a wait and see, and going to be very cautious about moving forward out of what we've experienced. You've probably got 10% that are in the camp of, I'm ready to get back to normal. I will weigh on the side of less caution, and I just want to help, and I want to do that. And so really just being able to understand where your people are in that continuum, and be able to adapt to them, because you may have pockets of volunteer opportunities that fit that 10% who are ready to get going, and as long as you provide them with the branded mask of your organization and do the kind of the minimum requirements and ask them to do those things, then you can move forward. But clearly, we don't know how long it's going to take for those percentages to shift back to a quote unquote normal state. Our colleagues heard a great reference that it's the new abnormal. I mean, we may never go back to normal, and for some of our sector, that's probably a good thing, because we shouldn't engage volunteers the way that we did in the past. We should do it differently, to the point, Marie, of really answering your question around use this as an opportunity to build a more resilient community through better practices, better technology, better understanding of how to deliver on your mission.
That's fantastic. So one of the things that's been coming in, I'm curious about, so I'm going to skip around a little bit, Marie, but I'm curious about this idea of, and I know, Michele, you're in a bit of a rural area. We were talking earlier about being out there a little bit and not having the best connectivity or count-onable connectivity every single minute of every day. So when we look forward to this new normal, to your point, whatever it may look like as well, how do we think about building programs that are really inclusive, that allow all of the folks who want to be engaged in the way that makes sense for them? And how do you think about some of those corner cases of, I don't have reliable internet, or I don't have access to these programs?
Yeah, it's a great point, and it's definitely challenging. I am in a rural area, but I do have internet. There are plenty of people across the U.S. who don't have access to the internet at all. And it's really a balance between the needs of your organization and then the meaningful opportunities that you can have. I think as nonprofits, we have a responsibility to try and be as inclusive as possible. So sometimes focus groups can be really helpful in that way. Getting a small group together of, maybe clients that you're trying to serve, or volunteers who've been with you for a long time, to kind of get a cross section of different needs and, demographics, experience areas, what have you, and, hear from them directly about what barriers are you seeing. And then that can, again, try and reverse engineer ways to overcome those barriers. But it's definitely challenging. And personally, I think that, every organization should come up with meaningful opportunities so that the volunteer has a chance to give in an impactful way. So you don't want to create an opportunity just for the sake of having a non-internet based volunteer opportunity if it's not doing anything for your organization. But I think also, being connected to organizations like VolunteerMatch, knowing that there are resources out there to say, hey, you know, in our organization, we really do need you to have access to a computer. We need you to have access to email and internet connection. But if we don't have the volunteer opportunity you're looking for, you should check out VolunteerMatch or, you know, the other resources that you can go to try and find opportunities within your community that would fit your needs.
That's great advice. Any other thoughts, Doug, that you want to add?
Yeah, I think, Laura, I think what this crisis has really exposed, you know, we already had great inequities in our country before, and this crisis has exposed those inequities enormously. You know, so the whole divide between broadband and those who don't have access, that problem still exists, but it's obviously exacerbated in this situation. And so I think what that means is the funder community, the philanthropy community needs to be able to make wise investments and wise decisions, and those decisions need to be based on data and impact. And so that's why we feel so strongly about every community should be able to collect that data, collect those stories, and be able to understand where their community is, where the broadband divide is, or where the impact is on the education community in terms of being able to deliver. I've heard one educator talk about how we have to be prepared in the education industry for essentially waves of closing. You know, so you know, weeks of school, and then maybe we'll be closed because of something. And so being able to you know, deliver content to students in some manner. You know, I know in one of our communities that we work in, the school system has taken their buses, which are Wi-Fi enabled, and essentially driven the buses into every community that is essentially underserved, to provide the students and the families in those communities with Wi-Fi access. So solutions like that, you know, those buses are just sitting, you know, unused right now. So why not put them to use? The bus drivers are, you know, protected with their equipment. The kids don't have to come into the bus. All they have to do is get near the bus, and the Wi-Fi is enabled for them. So that's those kinds of community solutions. And I know there was a question about cost. You know, there's a lot of providers right now that are essentially waiving fees and typical costs and those kinds of things. And I know in our own instance, we have funding that is essentially said to us, go provide these tools to every community that wants it. And we put that in place, and we believe, you know, we show the data on a community basis, a statewide basis, and ultimately a national basis. There will be a funder that says, I want to support this. I don't want this to be piecemeal. I want every community to have the kind of volunteer ecosystem rebuilding tools that are in some of the communities that have been able to afford it. So you know, don't let cost stop you from your creative thinking and thinking that there is a resilient solution.
Yeah, thanks, Doug. It's I think it's always nice and inspiring and just helpful to hear about how folks are putting resources to use in creative ways right now. I want to link a couple of questions that have come in, a couple around kind of what are some of the volunteer activities that most lend themselves to virtual volunteering? Like if there are a couple that you see really being a great starting point for virtual opportunities. And then some other folks have also asked, you know, ask questions like, I don't have an active volunteer program, or my volunteer program has now been dormant for 6 weeks and I really need to inject it with some new life. And we're really starting from scratch again, instead of starting from a core that has maybe atrophied a little bit, but is still there. And so I'm curious if, Doug, Michele, what advice you would offer either about maybe some of those go-to virtual opportunities or ways that folks who are really trying to kind of relaunch a volunteering effort could think about doing that right now.
Yeah, so in terms of, oh, sorry, Doug, I didn't mean to step on you. So in terms of opportunities that lend themselves well to virtual volunteering, I'm a big believer in virtual mentoring because that happens every day in our organization, and we see amazing impact on our clients just from a 45-minute, hour-long conversation. It's high impact volunteering. You get a lot of bang for your buck when it comes to the exchange of ideas and specific recommendations that happens through mentoring. But the other thing I wanted to mention on this call is I'm sure that everyone who works in the nonprofit sector has that list of projects or to-do items that have just continued to be pushed off because we don't have time, right? There are always so many things to do and, you know, events that are happening and different initiatives and priorities. But now is a time when we may be, you know, maybe a little slower operationally, or maybe events have been canceled. So we've got a little more time on our hands. Dig that project list up and see if there's an opportunity to engage a volunteer in, you know, research for one of those projects, or data entry or cleanup, you know, database management to make sure that you've got all of your processes in place. Anything from those focus groups that I mentioned, program evaluation, you know, those are all things that are they're a little nerdy for sure. So I'll own up to that, but they're great opportunities for folks to contribute in a meaningful way where they can be off-site. You can do the communication like this or over the phone and give direction to a volunteer to give research back in a meaningful way. So those are just a few ideas, but to Doug's point before, I mean, the creative piece it's kind of, you know, an open door. The sky is really the limit in terms of the way people can contribute in meaningful ways. So.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing that I would add to that is just looking at industries that are less or more affected by COVID, and being able to map what the skills you need around those industries. So for instance, you know, obviously commercial real estate, construction is been drastically impacted right now, and so there's a lot of real estate professionals that are kind of looking for work to do. And so if I'm running a nonprofit and I've had this series of real estate issues that I've never gotten to because I either don't have the money, don't have that expertise on my board, now is the time to reach into that kind of skills-based environment in terms of, you know, getting that work done for you immediately. And then also just thinking about, you know, demographics, you know, people, you know, I know that you know, people that are susceptible to COVID are less likely to be interested in going out, but they are you know, no less interested in helping. So engage them in the letter writing and the calling and the, you know, so there's pockets of population organizations that represent those groups that you could engage in to get that kind of work done. And then I've already talked about the students, but you know, getting a Boy Scout troop or a Girl Scout troop who they're desperate to stay connected and do activities remotely online, having the power of a Girl Scout troop, doing things for other nonprofits, benefits, you know, not only the Girl Scouts, but it also benefits your organization. So just thinking about the pockets of volunteers who maybe you traditionally have never connected before, and that if you do it now and do it right, then maybe you're creating a more resilient community because you are creating pockets and connections of volunteers in a way that you've never thought of before. To the point of, you know, someone, Michele, I think you said, you know, there are some organizations right now that just absolutely cannot take volunteers, arts and culture organizations. So all of those folks who have been, you know, facilitators in museums, the docents, the folks who work at, you know, the arts institutions as ushers, all of those folks desperately have a need to help, but right now they can't do that help. And so they are available to do the things that normally they didn't have the time. So just thinking about those people who who already have the built-in system of volunteering 10 hours a week, but they can't do it today, you can tap that bank of volunteers.
That's fantastic. I think we probably have time for maybe one or two more questions, Marie.
Yeah, I think so.
You think? Okay. The one that was coming up for me, Doug, that you kind of are, both you and Michele are starting to speak to, that's looks pretty highly upvoted over here in the Q&A, is just, thinking about how volunteerism does need to change specifically for the future. So this is a great concept of resilience through connecting volunteers in new ways to different kinds of causes or to different kinds of skills areas that they might not have contributed to before. Are there any other specifics that either of you are seeing or are recommending for how we think as a sector differently for the future?
So, we're a service enterprise and Points of Light hub for service enterprise for Ohio, and big believers in the principles upon which that is based, the reimagining service. So you have to invest in your volunteerism ecosystem. For every dollar you get $3 to $6 return. It cannot be an add-on, so no longer can a CEO of a nonprofit just let the volunteer manager handle this work. It has to be focused at the top level, not be an add-on. And then it has to be everybody all together. That's why volunteer ecosystem is so important. It has to involve the faith community, the business community, the education community, the government. All have to get engaged in this process of building better volunteerism. And that's why our platforms actually work so well, is because we get everybody to the dance. Lots of people maybe fear stepping on toes, but at the end of the day, our platform connects all of those people together that typically would have thought, hey, that's our swim lane, you can't get in it. We bring all of those together. And then finally, focus on true community need. So yes, we love the tulip planters and the landscapes and the house builders and the painters and all those kinds of folks, but we have such community need across the country, whether it's educating our children, fixing poverty. And so getting volunteerism focused on that is the way that volunteerism can build muscle in a way that right now the sector doesn't have.
I definitely agree on the investment piece. I think there's a stereotype or an assumption out there that, oh, well, volunteers are free labor. So it's, the word free is associated with it, but it's people, it's time and talent. And, in my opinion, from my experience, I think you need to invest, to Doug's point, whether it's staff or, technology or what have you, and making sure that you're using the volunteers' time and talent to the best of your ability, or your organization's ability. So definitely continuing to hammer in on that investment piece is key. And the other thing I just wanted to make sure the audience is aware, corporate social responsibility programs are not going dormant in this time of COVID-19. Just anecdotally within our organization, over the same 4-week period last year in 2019, we saw almost a 300% increase in volunteer applications. So before, when corporations are looking for these one-day big service events in person, we don't have that opportunity, right? But those CSR programs are still looking for ways to give back and for ways that their employees can get engaged. So in terms of looking for supporters who can give back to your community or your cause, make sure that you're not discounting the CSR programs out there.
It's a great point, Michele, and really just points to how quickly things are moving in this space, and how, even over this last 30, 45 days, we've seen a shift from, I think, a lot of folks just not knowing where they could go and what to do, and then starting to very quickly form some opinions about that. Mm-hmm. So I know we're ready to wrap up, Marie. This hour's gone really fast. What a great discussion. And thanks so much for so many questions that are still, I think, some open ones still out there. I'll offer a couple of closing remarks that I see based on what I heard from our amazing panelists here. Some big takeaways for me that I've been capturing in my notes. Time to get creative and think outside the box. Doug gave us some great tips about practical solutions like drones and Wi-Fi buses. And, Michele really pointed to thinking about online mentoring and different ways of being very inclusive. And this concept of a need for us to be flexible in our long-term planning and comprehensive and think about where we're actually going and how the needs might be shifting. All really important points, I think, for us, especially if we're leading volunteer programs and organizations. I also really want to embrace this concept of finding and surfacing the stories that Doug brought up, helping your volunteers or potential volunteers see themselves in your mission and your programs in new ways. And don't let the cost stop you, because as Michele pointed out, there are resources available out there. I think, Doug, you echoed that as well. Whether those are corporate social responsibility resources or whether those are funders, there are folks who want to help on both sides of this equation, and your programs don't have to suffer just because we're not sure quite where to go. Just think creatively about how you can use your volunteers. And the final piece I took away from, a little nugget that I took away, think beyond your core service delivery model, because this is a great time to work that to-do list. And we all have, for sure, a laundry list of things we need in our advocacy and research, et cetera, space. So what a great opportunity for us to think differently about how we put skilled volunteers and students, et cetera, into service to build more resilient communities. Fantastic points from both of you. Thanks so much. I learned a ton.
Same. Doug, Michele, I'd love to turn it to you to offer one last parting thought, if you have any, before we wrap up, and then I'll close us out for today.
I think what is going on in the COVID era is a resurgence of state leaders and state leadership, and so while we have been very focused on essentially providing our tools to every community that wants it, we believe there is power in the state roll up, and so we're working with leaders in Nevada and Michigan and Massachusetts about being able to show that data and show the stories on a statewide basis that really leads to policies that will help the sector down the road. So, it's not a and or, it's not about community or state, it is about community and state. And we look forward to working with both community leaders as well as state leaders in terms of accomplishing, the COVID-19 recovery and resiliency. So thank you again, Marie and Laura, for the opportunity.
Thanks, Doug. Yeah, and from my perspective, I would say my final piece of parting advice would be to give yourself some grace. We're all working through some really challenging times through, potentially trying to revamp your entire program or rethink your entire service delivery model. And we can do that. The points have been made several times on today's call that this is a resilient sector. We are very community-based, even though we all have different missions and priorities and locations. I love working in the nonprofit sector because I know that I can reach out to nearly anyone and find a great resource and an open ear or hand to help, guide me if I need some advice. So I would say, don't hesitate to do that. We do have a community that's willing to help out. And then also to be patient with yourself, try to tackle your big projects one at a time so that you can gain those small wins and build momentum. But we will get through this together. It's just one baby step at a time.
Thank you so much, Michele and Doug, for your thoughts and good advice and experience on today's webinar. And Laura, to you and your team, our good friends at VolunteerMatch, for helping to make today possible. We're so grateful for the partnership. And I just want to say a huge thanks to everyone in the audience today. I think we had one of the more active and responsive Q&A modules that I've seen on one of our webinars. So thank you for being resources to each other during this. Certainly, we are not the only experts that have something to contribute, and we're so glad to see all of your contributions and suggestions. If you are interested in learning more about what else Independent Sector is doing around COVID-19 response, there are 2 additional webinars coming up in the next couple of days. On Thursday, we have our weekly update this week in Washington on public policy around COVID response, and next Tuesday, we're hosting a webinar on unshakable presence in turbulent times about how to sustain leadership during this very critical moment. So thank you again. Please share your feedback during our post-event survey, and we hope to see you on another event soon. Thank you so much.